Hello and welcome everybody to the first press conference of the penultimate day of the ESOF meeting. We're lucky to have two people here to discuss what I think is certainly the most important issue on the planet, life itself, and how we conserve it. And with us we have a field biologist and a zookeeper. They're going to tell you things that I hope will make you sit up. And our first speaker is Dalia Conde, who is at the Department of Biology at the Max Planck Odense Center at the University of Southern Denmark, and she will be followed by Bengt Holst, who's the Director of Research and Conservation at Copenhagen Zoo. Dalia.
Hello everybody. It is a great pleasure to be here today. I am a field biologist, or I was a field biologist. I studied in my home
Could you push the button of the mic?
It's not on. Oh, now it's better. Okay. And I did my PhD working with jaguars. This is a big cat, really elusive and mysterious. Of the three big cats, is the one that we know the least. And I was in the jungle trapping them, putting GPS collars to study their movement and understand their behavior. To be honest, when I was working in the tropical forest, I never imagined I was going to be fascinated by the world of zoos. And it was until I realized that we needed a lot of data in order to understand why a population becomes extinct, when I realized the important role of zoos. When you go to a zoo, usually you sit down and you see 2 polar bears, 5 parrots, and you don't imagine what is the wealth of zoos. But when you look, not at one zoo, but you look at the world of zoos, you realize that these 5 parrots that are maybe in Copenhagen Zoo, there are another 5 in the Odense Zoo, and then if you start adding up in the whole world, you get to populations that are over hundreds individuals for some species. So what got me to the world of zoos was data. Scientists were data junkies, and I was amazed by the amount of data you can find in zoos. This data is usually centered in an organization that is called the International Species Information System, ICES, not the best acronym to have right now. And this data, you can know everything about the individuals you have in zoos. And you stop seeing at animals in zoos as one individual, but you see them as a population, a meta-populations of many individuals. But in 2010, when I went to the first meeting of the Conservation Breeding Specialist Group and WASA, I realized that data is just a minimum part of what all the zoos are doing in sense of conservation. What is surprising is that zoos are doing a lot for conservation, but they get very little credit for it. And that was a surprise for me. The other interesting part is that they're doing a lot of work in the sense of connecting wild conservation with captive conservation. A lot of people, well, including Bengt, they're in the wild, working with tapirs and other species. The only difference between their projects are my project is that they have much more money. Zoos give $350 million dollars per year to conservation projects in the wild, for species in the wild. And they get very little credit for it as well. When we look at zoos, we don't realize the amount of wealth we have, about how little, we know very little about biodiversity, about our species. And we have a lot of data in the zoos, which is key for conservation. It is surprising that, for example, there are more tigers in the state of Texas in private collections than in the wild. And we don't know anything about those tigers. However, when you look at the world of zoos, you have a big network where you can get tons of information. So if we think about the number of threatened species in the world, 1 of every 7 threatened species is represented by the zoo network. And captive breeding was one of the major conservation actions that helped to reduce the level of threat of 20%, 18 to be more precise, 18% of the species that reduce their conservation status. So what I want to insist is that we are on a biodiversity crisis. We are losing a species at a rate that is at least 300 times higher than normal rates. And if this rate do not stop, if we don't have this rate, we are going to lose our resources. We are going to lose the World Bank. The real World Bank is our planet. The real World Bank is biodiversity. And we need to include zoos as partners in conservation. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Bent.
Thank you very much. Well, as was said, I'm the Director of Research and Conservation in Copenhagen Zoo, but I'm also the Chairman of the European Office of the Conservation Breeder Specialist Group under IUCN. And I've been working with these issues for a little bit more than 30 years now, and in the latest years together with Dalia, more or less. I agree very much with what Dalia said already, and the article she wrote about where she compares the statistics in zoos and with threatened species. I agree with the statistics, but I may differ a little bit in my prioritization, the way I consider the various issues, because I don't think the number of threatened species in the zoos is so much important. It's more than important that how we work with these species, I mean the quality of the whole thing. We have to realize that even though there are many threatened species in the wild, there is not a captive role for all those species. I mean, there are some species that conservation matters, conservation activities should only be carried out in the wild. And for some species, there should be a captive part, but it may be in the wild as well, I mean, where the animals actually live and not in the zoos. So only for those species where there is a defined role for zoos, that's the ones we should prioritize and those we should focus on. And that's what we do. And that's there's just been, nearly been published now, the new ex situ conservation guidelines from IUCN. They have some guidelines of how to manage ex situ population, meaning those population of animals outside the natural habitat. How to manage those. And they have not been revised, and in the new revision of these guidelines, it is stated very clearly how to select those species where zoos should play a role, or ex situ institutions should play a role. And it is very important then to define the specific role they play. I mean, we can play a role in captive breeding, we can play a role in research, we can play a role in education, or we can play a role for reintroduction of these animals. And according to those roles that are defined for the various species, we can then manage our animal populations in the zoos. So I see the bigger challenge is so far not the number of threatened species in the zoos, but it is how we work together regarding these animals. And I think the big challenge will be to make all this puzzle fit for all the pieces. As you can see, the conservation puzzle is a very complex one. It consists of a lot of small pieces, many more than you can see on the photo up there. And only if we address all these pieces in the puzzle, we can make proper conservation. And that means that we have to make sure that all players are actually playing their game, and they are actually playing in, and they do what they're supposed to do according to the roles defined for their specific activities. And for example, the zoos could be in education, it could be for captive breeding, but it could also be for some field research. And to come back to Dalia's talking about data. We need so much data about the specific biological data. What is the breeding season? How many youngs do they come? What is the longevity of the animals, etc., etc. We cannot get that from the wild because it's difficult to get close to the animals in the wild, but we can get lots of those data in the zoos, and based on those data, we can then make the right conservation plans. So the big challenge, I think, is to make all captive units, including the zoos, play their roles as they should do according to the role they have been defined in the ex situ according to the ex situ guidelines. And that's quite a big challenge. But it's not only the zoos, because there are some legislation. Of course, we have to obey legislation. And one of the big challenges for conservation is the fragmentation of the many populations in the wild. They are fragmented, a lot of small populations that where the animals will never meet, so they will die out for genetic reasons because the populations, each of the populations are too small to survive in the wild. So if we don't mix those genes in the very small populations, they will die out. And that's one of the big challenges. And, but in order to do that, we need to move animals from one place to another in order to mix the genes. And sometimes these movements, they include crossing of borders. And crossing of borders means you go from one legislation to another legislation. And a lot of these legislations are counteracting conservation. And even one of these legislations that is in order to conserve animals, conserve the species, the CITES regulations, sometimes they become an obstacle because it takes such a long time to get the papers ready to make a move of one animal from one country to another in order to have some conservation breeding, that the animals nearly die before they can be sent away, so they are counteractive to what they are actually implemented for. And we need to address these legislative issues if we want to have this meta-population management, and that is necessary. So this is a question of getting the zoos together, make them live up to the roles they have, and they all talk about they have, and to make the politicians make sure that the legislation they make don't make any obstacles for conservation, and then to get all the other actors in place so that we can cooperate, be it field biologists or captive environment, doesn't matter. And we have to take away the old prejudice that many have against each other. A lot of people from the field, they don't think zoos can contribute to anything. And many zoo people, they don't think that the field people are worth anything. So we need to get away from this one and make people cooperate instead of fighting each other. Only in that way we can conserve species in the wild.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm now open for questions. Can I just remind you, first of all, that we've got a roving microphone because this is being recorded, and when you if you ask for if you have a question, state your name and your affiliation before the question, so that everyone knows who it was who asked that particularly penetrating question. Right, there.
Hi, Christine Delamore with National Geographic. I'm curious how the situation with the giraffe, the controversial one, could have gone better in your mind if some of this, what you're saying now, had been implemented. Like how could it have been more successful or different?
Well, to make it very short, I think it actually went pretty well, seen in a long perspective, because the issue that should have been discussed many years ago, because it is a controversial issue, but a very important issue for conservation, to keep up healthy populations in a sorry. But that should have been discussed, and now at least is on the agenda all over the world. And that, I think, is good, because only if we discuss these things in the open and are open about it, are honest about what we're doing and why we do it, because we want to maintain healthy populations, then we can get the right framework for managing our animal population and thereby to do proper conservation. So I actually think at the first step it was tough, but in the end it was good.
And I would like just to add to the giraffe issue, I totally agree with Bengt. And I want to add that when you look at zoos, you're not looking just at one or two giraffe. You need to look at the world of zoos and how many individuals there are and how you manage them. And one of the biggest problems that zoos have is space. So conservation biologists were really pushing that zoos have a major focus of breeding threatened species. Giraffe is not a threatened species. So what will be the challenge? If zoos start focusing more on development management programs of threatened species, we're going to be facing these management issues. And I think it needs to be on the open. And we need to be sometimes a little bit cold-minded on how we can manage this. Yeah, well, we need to be very open about how we manage this. What we do with individuals and maybe they're not genetically, they don't contribute to the health of the population. And sometimes very hard decisions are taken.
But it's a good example of when emotions are talking to the rationality. I mean, it's very rational to work with these things. And we need to look at the long-term goal. And if we want to look at the populations, which is very important for conservation, then sometimes some individuals don't fit in, which is normal. That's normal in the wild as well. And then we have to make the decision so that we go for the overall goal and not for the individual goal.
Chelsea Wald, reporting for Earth Touch News Network. So following up on this, people were outraged, the public was outraged by the giraffe, but what do you think, where would you like to direct people's outrage? And then a follow-up, just what are some specific examples of legislation that are really getting in the way of conservation, specific animals, specific countries?
What?
Can I answer first? Thank you. I will just answer first because Bengt knows better about the legislation, but about the outreach. For me, it was shocking how the media covered one giraffe. And we had the Christmas Island pipistrelle species became extinct, which is a beautiful bat species that play a very important ecosystem role in Australia. It became extinct in 2011, and nothing heard about it. We have a full evolutionary lineage. We lost thousands of years on evolution. A species doesn't come back. At least, no yet, we don't know how to bring back a species that became extinct. And the media and everybody are outraged about the giraffe. And we can lose a species, and nobody says anything. So for me, that was really, really quite amazing.
It was out of proportions. And regarding the legislation, it's not so much the legislation itself. I mean, we all have health regulations, which is good because we have to make sure that we don't spread diseases and all this stuff. But it's the implementation of the legislation and the implementation of the regulations. Sometimes it becomes very bureaucratic, and red tapes also with regard to CITES. So they take such a long time to work with these things because people they don't think about the goal with those legislations or those regulations. They only think about what is written on paper, and to make sure that they cover their own back, they have to make sure that everything fits, and it takes weeks and weeks and months. And I can say we have 2 threatened armor leopards in Copenhagen Zoo. They're going to United States, and this has been prepared for more than 9 months now, and we are still not got the American paper, the CITES import permit from United States because of bureaucratic things. I mean, there is no issue in this because they are captive bred, and the overall goal is clear. But there are so many bureaucratic red tapes we have to overcome before getting this. And these animals get old before they go to the United States, meaning that's really an obstacle to the breeding programs, which is global.
Can you tell us just a little bit more about the Amur leopard?
Yeah, the Amur leopard is a species which is in the Siberian region, and there are only around 30-35 specimens left in the wild. And there's a captive breeding program actually globally. That we have a major population here in Europe and a smaller population in the United States. But globally we work together in order to get animals enough whenever, so that we do have animals when the reintroduction can be an issue. And we're working together with the field people. But in order to make this breeding program work, we need to exchange animals in order to avoid inbreeding. And this is where we need to get animals across borders, because it's not only within one country, it's across the several legislations. And that's where the legislation or the implementation of the legislation and the regulations should be much more looking at the purpose of why they're there instead of looking at the paragraphs themselves, as long as we don't jeopardize health or anything else of the animals or in the country.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the animal itself, how it survives in the wild? I
can
imagine it.
Well, the Amur leopard lives in a very, very arid area, and they live very far from each other because it's a very harsh environment. And one of the biggest problems have been hunting. They've been hunted for the fur because there's a very, very beautiful fur, but also for medicine. I mean, from what do you call it, local medicine. They think that if you take the bones and eat the bones or eat the powder from the bones, then you can get cured for several diseases, etc. And then a lot of its prey has been hunted by humans as well. So it's actually it's competing with humans about the prey. And because the prey has been hunted down to a number that is now so low that the Amur leopard cannot find enough food, then it's a very bad situation for them in the wild.
My
But this is nearly under control now. So if we can get this under control and we can get the whole area protected, because it's the same area that the Amur tiger is living in, then there is a framework ready for doing some reintroductions, and it's very close for the tiger and will be for the leopard too.
Thank you. Have you all been stunned by that?
I must also, can I just just add one more thing? I think we also have a big responsibility in the zoo world to take our role seriously. Too many zoos, now I'm talking in general, too many zoos all over the world are bragging of working for conservation without doing what they're actually supposed to do. And that, of course, destroys the reputation of zoos. So when I say zoos need to take the role seriously, I see they have to take on that role, even if it costs money, because it is a very important role. And those that are only talking about it and not doing anything should pull their something together and get things done. And we have, since 1999, we have an EU directive saying that zoos should only be approved in the various countries based on their conservation activities. So we have to work for conservation, actively for conservation, one way or another, in order to be approved of, as a zoo. Otherwise, it makes no sense to have these animals in this confined area.
How many Amur leopards do you have, and how many are there in the zoos? I mean, I know you'll have to guess.
We have 4 for the moment. We have 2. We have a pair and 2 offspring that we now want to get off to another to San Diego Zoo. And in general, I think that it's around 130 in captivity in altogether in the global population. So there's much more than is in the wild, but we cannot do anything with them until it's safe in the wild. Yeah. I just want to go back to the other thing, that based on this EU directive, too many zoos have used their time to try to find out how they could fit their activities to fit into the directives demand, instead of seeing the possibilities and the challenges these demands puts on them. So they should actually go and do some work instead of trying to explain, well, I do this can be considered conservation. So we also have to look inside ourselves and see, are we doing enough? And some serious zoos are doing really a great job, and they do a lot. But they are jeopardized a little bit by those that just play undercover.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
Chelsea Wald again. Can you comment a little on the less charismatic species? Because I know that's part of your work, Dalia.
Yes. Well, one of the problems, and it's something that that I think is a big problem that zoos face, but they're finding very interesting ways, is that most of the public, they get used to go to the zoo to see a giraffe or see an elephant. And but zoos have a very big responsibility, we can say, as being as cultural centers and educator centers, to as well get public in touch with local species. And the species are maybe in your backyard, small amphibians. We are now facing the amphibian crisis. 30% of amphibian populations are threatened with extinction. This is unbelievable. Amphibians really tell us how healthy our environment it is. If we have high pesticides or contaminated waters, amphibians will tell us if we are in a healthy environment or not. And for example, in Denmark, we have some amphibian populations that are becoming extinct. And I think zoos can do a lot in this sense to get the public attention and get people close to animals that are not furry and cute that usually people expect to see in zoos. But when you go to a zoo, they can really open this curiosity, especially with kids and as well with adults, and to really look at the backyard species and taking care of the local species. And I think that's a challenge, but for example, in London Zoo, we're very successful with a project that is called Books, that is to look at insects, and that exhibit has been very, very, very successful. Copenhagen Zoo has an amazing zookeeper who has been one of the best breeders of amphibians, Lene Rasmussen, and she has a project of Bombina Bombina, which is amazing. They're introducing these species in in
Estonia
and in the Fun Island that is here. So of course some zoos are doing their part, but I honestly think it's not enough.
And I think we could do a lot under this umbrella because, of course, we need to have a big variety of animals because what we want to tell the people is that the diversity of animals is huge and is so fascinating. And what we want to plant within the minds of people is the fascination of this big diversity. And if we can fascinate those people, then they also take responsibility, and through their responsibility, they do conservation. So that's the way to people's mind, by showing the diversity from the elephants to the small frogs and to the insects. But then within this framework, we can work with a lot of local species, but also not local species. And the amphibian crisis is a good example because that's where many zoos took over some frog species that needed captive breeding because they were actually dying out in the wild because of this disease coming very fast in the various parts of the world. And they took on the role and they started breeding those frogs. The public couldn't necessarily see them, but they just told about the stories. So still within the umbrella of having all the other species that people visited, then they got the opportunity to breed those endangered ones, and with the purpose of reintroducing them when the disease in the wild has passed, and that will happen within the next 5 or 10 years. So it's some sort of a assurance population. But sometimes we focus, and that's right, we focus on the very charismatic species. But that's also for some reason because if we can capture people's minds by showing the magnificent species, then and do some conservation work based on these species. For example, the golden lion. I don't know if you know the golden lion tamarin. The golden lion tamarin is a little monkey this size, like a squirrel. It's orange, very cute, very nice looking. And it has been very endangered. And when in the late 60s, there were only 150 back in the wild. And then the zoos got together and started a breeding program. And they got a population which was very close to 300. And then in 1983, they reintroduced the first specimens of this species in the wild. And today, they have reintroduced nearly 200 individuals. And the population has grown to 1,700. So from 150 to 1,700 within 30 years, which is a great result. But we should not forget, by reintroducing this, we also conserve the habitat this lion tamarin is living on, because people they want this species to be conserved. And then all the other anonymous species living in the same habitat, on the ground, in the trees, but we normally don't care about the snails, the slimy ones, the ugly-looking ones, etc. They are saved as well because the habitat is saved because of the lion tamarin. So sometimes we use some of the more charismatic species as flagship species and save some habitat through them. And that's, you could say it's cheating. It's not, because we do it, but we will save a lot through these methods. And we can tell the story in the zoos because we have the public coming to the zoos anyway because they want to see all the animals, all the charismatic ones. So for example, in Copenhagen, we have 1.2 million guests a year, visitors a year. So that story that WWF and all the other ones that want to tell their people, they have very big difficulties in getting out to people with those stories. But we have the guests just in front of our door and saying, well, if we can tell the story in the right way to 1.2 million guests a year, we have really got the message out. And that's the way to spread the word about conservation and also to spread responsibility. So that's another angle of doing conservation in zoos. It's not the direct captive breeding, but that's the purpose of having these animals in the zoos.
And just to add to bank numbers, if you think of all the zoos in the world that belong to the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, we have 10% of the planet population going to a zoo every year. 10% of the planet. If all those zoos really have a very strong commitment on education and conservation, they can make a huge difference. And we're talking that people that go to a zoo, you have all demographics. You have from very young kids to the grandparents that take the people to the zoo. They reach all economic classes, all cultures. So the outreach that zoos can have is huge in that sense.
But I think that makes it very important that we also tell the right story. Then coming back to the giraffe, because it's so important that we tell the real story about what is wildlife, what is the circumstances they live under in the wild, etc. We should not tell the Disney story. We should not tell the Bambi story that animals are always so only cute animals and they only get born, they never die, etc., etc. We have to tell the real story so people realize that this is wild, which is not strange. I mean, death is a natural consequence of life, or natural follow-up on life. And if we don't tell that story, we do a bad job, because then we don't work for conservation, then we work for an imaginary world which will never survive in real life. So, and that's why we should, well, some zoos should do a better job.
Yeah, you can have the ecology story and science-based stories, and you can have the fairy tale story. So I think it's a hard decision. And zoos are always say, well, we don't want to talk about conservation and the biodiversity crisis because people leave the zoo depressed and they won't come back. So in that sense, the same thing, we don't want, for example, it's amazing, I'm now studying zoo populations to see how we can use this data to understand species in the wild. However, I have a big problem to understand, for example, bonobos. Because bonobos in zoos in the US are not allowed to have sex because people complain when they go to the zoos. They say, oh no, they're all the time having sex, which is particularly of the bonobos. So the way they manage bonobos in Europe is totally different how they're managed in the US because of this public attention. So it's really challenging to see, well, what is the role of zoos? Is really to give the fairy Bambi tale story, or is to show about ecology, evolution, mortality, reproduction, which includes sex, to the general public? So that's a very, very, very big challenge. And for us scientists, it's very important to know exactly how zoos are managed if we want to extract data to understand species diversity. Because unfortunately, we know very little about our planet. We depend on it. All our resources come from what we call the diversity of life, the species, the ecosystems. Our water comes from there. Our clean air, genetic, thousands of medicines and vaccinations to be discovered that's our World Bank. And we know very little of how to manage. So if you come tomorrow to our session, I will make this commercial, we're going to talk about how little do we know about biodiversity and how important it is to get this knowledge. And part of the discussion is as well the role of zoos on this and on getting a grab on the biodiversity knowledge.
We have another questioner here.
Hi. I'm Tanya, I work for Science Magazine. This may be a really silly question, but I was wondering if we could give a badge to the good zoos, some kind of standard or certificate that they could strive for, and also get visitors to the ones that actually do good work?
Well, it's of course difficult, but I must say that in general, those that are part of a regional zoo association are normally the scientifically based zoos, and those are the ones that work on a scientific basis, meaning also that they work for conservation in a proper way. Whereas those that are not part of this association, it is not to make a commercial for these ones, they work on another framework, and I mean, it's up to them to choose if they want to be part of it. But most zoos that I would call serious zoos, they are the ones under regional association. Here in Europe, we have EAZA, which is the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria, and there are around 330 zoos as members. And in addition to those, you still can count around 1,000 small zoos in Europe that are not members of those ones. So I think it's difficult to make a real brand, but at least you know that they're scientifically based.
And to add to Benk's comment, I think that's a very big issue because zoos that belong in an association, for example, EAZA, they're in a network, so they're managing their populations. They have this population management. And as well, zoos that belong to the International Species Information System, they're part of this global network for management. I don't know very well which are the EAZA to become a member. But usually, to become a member, you need to pass an inspection. And what I have heard is that those inspections are quite scary. So they really prepare very well, and those inspections these type of inspections are done in regular basis for the zoos that are members.
And we also have to realize that zoos, I mean, in earlier days, a zoo was just a zoo, and then they cooperated with those that they knew. But today, the zoos are just a little part of a big network, and we can only survive as part of this network from other zoos, globally or regionally. And as for the breeding programs, which is very important in this case, we have in Europe around 200 breeding programs, and they are coordinated by special species coordinators, and people have to they have to obey to the recommendations coming from this species coordinator, because he bases his or her recommendations on which is going to breed with whom. That's a sort of a dating bureau. Based on scientific data, I mean on relationship and demography, etc. So it's only from the biological needs that these animals are brought together to get the best population ever. Whereas in earlier days it was just, I know you better than you know him, so I take my animals from your place. So that's a very bad way of doing it. And that's also why it's so important that we just don't send the animals to strange places that don't cooperate under the same framework as we do, because we need to take responsibility for our animals, make sure that they live under all proper conditions, and that when they are going to breed, they breed with animals that will produce sound and healthy offspring and not inbred offspring. And that's why we were so strict about the giraffe not going to somewhere else under another framework, or even taking space up at other places where they would just take space up for more valuable animals seen from a genetic point of view. That's all coordinated based on scientific data.
I think we've reached a natural end to the questioning here, but there will be an opportunity afterwards to talk to our speakers, and of course they'll be here tomorrow too. Indeed, as Dahlia's reminded us, performing in the morning. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to our speakers, and the next press conference is in half an hour.